Margaret sat quietly in the corner of the busy coffee shop, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. At 72 years old, she had learned to appreciate the simple pleasures in life. The morning rush was in full swing around her, with young professionals hurrying past her table, barely glancing at the elderly woman in worn jeans and a faded jacket. She had chosen this particular spot because it reminded her of the mess halls from decades ago. The constant chatter, the clinking of dishes, the organized chaos of people moving with purpose. It brought back memories of a different time, when she was younger and the world seemed full of possibilities she never imagined she would actually experience. The coffee shop was located just outside the gates of Fort Braxton, one of the largest military installations in the country. Margaret came here every Tuesday morning, not because the coffee was particularly good, but because it felt like home, in a way that her small apartment never quite could. The familiar sight of uniformed personnel coming and going gave her a sense of connection to a life that felt increasingly distant with each passing year. Today, like most days, she observed the interactions around her with the keen eye of someone who had spent years watching people. She noticed how the young soldiers deferred to their superiors, how they carried themselves with a mixture of pride and nervousness, how they laughed a little too loudly at jokes that weren't particularly funny. It all reminded her of herself at that age, though she suspected none of these young people would believe such a thing if she told them. A group of 3 soldiers at a nearby table caught her attention. They were discussing their upcoming deployment, their voices carrying a mixture of excitement and apprehension that she remembered all too well. One of them, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, was expressing doubts about whether she was ready for the responsibility ahead of her. "I just don't know if I have what it takes," the young soldier was saying, stirring her coffee nervously. "I mean, I've been through all the training, but actually being in charge of people's lives? That's something else entirely." Her companions offered the usual reassurances, but Margaret could see that the words weren't really reaching the young woman. There was a look in her eyes that Margaret recognized, a combination of determination and fear that came with the territory of military service. It was a look she had worn herself many years ago, though in her case, the stakes had been even higher than these young soldiers could imagine. Without really thinking about it, Margaret found herself standing and walking over to their table. The 3 soldiers looked up in surprise as the elderly woman approached them. She could see the polite confusion in their faces, the way they were trying to figure out what this civilian might want from them. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came with age. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. I hope you don't mind an old woman offering some unsolicited advice." The young soldier who had been expressing doubts looked up with curious eyes. "Of course not, ma'am. We'd be happy to listen." Margaret smiled, appreciating the young woman's politeness. "I just wanted to tell you that the fact that you're worried about the responsibility means you're exactly the kind of person who should be trusted with it. The people who never question themselves, who never feel the weight of what they're being asked to do, those are the ones you need to worry about." She paused, looking at each of the 3 soldiers in turn. "You'll make mistakes. Everyone does. But if you keep that sense of responsibility, that awareness of how important your decisions are, you'll do better than you think." The soldiers nodded respectfully, though Margaret could tell they were seeing her as nothing more than a well-meaning elderly civilian. She didn't blame them for that assumption. After all, how could they know that she had once faced responsibilities that made their upcoming deployment seem routine by comparison? As she returned to her table, Margaret caught fragments of their continued conversation. They were polite enough not to comment on her intervention directly, but she could sense their bemusement. To them, she was just another civilian who had never worn the uniform, never understood the true weight of military service. It was an assumption she had grown accustomed to over the years. The truth was far more complicated than these young soldiers could possibly imagine. Margaret's service record was buried so deep in classified files that most people who had served with her were probably unaware of the full extent of what she had accomplished. The missions she had participated in, the operations she had led, the lives she had saved, and the strategic victories she had helped secure were all locked away in vaults that would likely never be opened to public scrutiny. She had served during an era when women in combat roles were virtually unheard of. when the very idea of a female soldier leading dangerous missions behind enemy lines was considered impossible by most military leaders. But necessity had a way of breaking down even the most entrenched prejudices, and Margaret's unique combination of skills, intelligence, and sheer determination had made her invaluable to certain specialized units that operated in the shadows. Her official military record showed a respectable but unremarkable career in logistics and administration. The real story was hidden in files marked with classification levels that exceeded most generals' security clearances. Even her decorations and commendations were classified, stored away where they could never be displayed or acknowledged publicly. This secrecy had been necessary at the time. The operations she had been involved in were so sensitive, so crucial to national security, that acknowledging her participation would have compromised ongoing missions and put other operatives at risk. She had understood this when she agreed to the assignments, had accepted that her service would likely never be publicly recognized. But understanding something intellectually and living with its emotional consequences were two very different things. Over the years, Margaret had watched as male veterans were honored and celebrated for their service, while her own contributions remained invisible. She had sat through countless Veterans Day ceremonies, listening to speeches about the sacrifices made by America's military heroes, knowing that her own sacrifices would never be acknowledged in such forums. It wasn't that she regretted her service. Far from it. The missions she had completed had genuinely made the world a safer place, had prevented conflicts that could have cost thousands of lives. She took pride in that knowledge, even if she could never share the details with anyone else. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. She had no fellow veterans to reminisce with, no unit reunions to attend, no shared stories to tell. Her military experience was a lonely treasure, valuable beyond measure but impossible to share. Even her family had only the vaguest understanding of what she had really done during her years of service. Her daughter, who lived across the country with her own family, often expressed frustration that her mother didn't seem to take advantage of veterans' benefits or participate in veterans' organizations. "Mom, you served your country," she would say during their weekly phone calls. "You should be proud of that. You should let people know about your service." But how could Margaret explain that her service was something that couldn't be publicly acknowledged? How could she tell her daughter that the medals she had earned were sitting in a secure facility somewhere, never to be displayed on a mantle or worn on a uniform? How could she describe the weight of carrying secrets that had shaped the course of history? So she had learned to live with the assumption that she was just another civilian, another elderly woman whose opinions about military matters were polite but ultimately irrelevant. She had developed a thick skin about the casual dismissal she often encountered when she tried to contribute to conversations about military service or foreign policy. The irony was not lost on her that she, who had once been trusted with some of the nation's most sensitive operations, was now considered by most people to be just another civilian observer. The young soldiers in the coffee shop, well-meaning and respectful as they were, clearly saw her as someone who could offer only the kind of generic encouragement that civilians typically provided to military personnel. As Margaret sat back at her table, nursing her coffee and watching the familiar rhythm of military life continue around her, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. There had been times, especially in the years immediately following her retirement from active duty, when the invisibility of her service had felt like a betrayal. She had given everything to her country, had risked her life repeatedly, had made sacrifices that few people could imagine, and yet none of it could ever be acknowledged. But age had brought a different perspective. She had come to understand that the true measure of her service was not in the recognition she received, but in the knowledge of what she had accomplished. The operations she had led had saved lives, had prevented disasters, had made the world a better place in ways that could never be quantified or celebrated. Still, there were moments when the weight of her invisible service felt overwhelming. When she saw other veterans being honored for their contributions, when she listened to stories of military heroism that seemed small compared to what she had experienced but could never share, when she felt the profound isolation that came with being the keeper of secrets that would die with her. The coffee shop was beginning to empty out as the morning rush came to an end. The three young soldiers had finished their conversation and were preparing to leave. As they gathered their things, The young woman who had expressed doubts about her readiness caught Margaret's eye and offered a small wave of thanks. Margaret waved back, wondering what the future held for these young soldiers. Would they face the kind of challenges she had faced? Would their service be acknowledged and celebrated? Or would they too find themselves carrying invisible burdens that could never be shared? She hoped, for their sake, that their contributions would be recognized, that their sacrifices would be acknowledged, that they would never have to experience the strange limbo of being a hero whose heroism could never be revealed. They deserved better than the isolation she had learned to accept as the price of her service. As the morning wore on and the coffee shop grew quieter, Margaret allowed herself to remember some of the missions that had defined her military career. Not the classified details, of course, but the emotions, the sense of purpose, the knowledge that what she was doing mattered in ways that transcended personal recognition. She remembered the young woman she had been when she first accepted those dangerous assignments, the mixture of fear and excitement that had driven her to excel in situations that would have broken many people. She remembered the colleagues who had trusted her with their lives, the commanders who had recognized her abilities even when military culture made it difficult to acknowledge them officially. Most of all, she remembered the sense of purpose that had sustained her through the most difficult moments of her service. The knowledge that her actions were making a difference, that the risks she was taking were protecting innocent lives, that the sacrifices she was making were preserving freedoms that others took for granted. That sense of purpose had never left her, even in retirement. It was what brought her to this coffee shop every Tuesday morning, what made her want to encourage young soldiers who reminded her of herself. It was what allowed her to find meaning in her invisible service, even when the lack of recognition felt like a weight she could barely carry. As she prepared to leave the coffee shop and return to her small apartment, Margaret caught her reflection in the window. She saw an elderly woman in unremarkable clothes, someone who would blend into any crowd, someone whose appearance gave no hint of the extraordinary life she had lived. It was a reflection she had grown accustomed to over the years, but it still struck her as somehow surreal. How could this ordinary-looking woman be the same person who had once operated behind enemy lines, who had led missions that required skills and courage that few people possessed, who had earned decorations that would never see the light of day? The disconnect between her public persona and her actual accomplishments had become such a constant part of her life that she rarely thought about it anymore. But today, for some reason, it felt more pronounced. Perhaps it was the encounter with the young soldiers, or perhaps it was simply one of those days when the weight of her secrets felt heavier than usual. As Margaret walked toward the door of the coffee shop, she had no way of knowing that her quiet, invisible existence was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. She had no idea that forces were already in motion that would soon bring her decades of hidden service into the light. She couldn't have guessed that her careful anonymity was about to be shattered by an encounter that would finally give her the recognition she had never dared to hope for. For now, she was simply an elderly woman, leaving a coffee shop, carrying secrets that had shaped history but could never be shared. Tomorrow would bring another quiet day in her small apartment, another Tuesday morning at the coffee shop, another conversation with young soldiers who would never guess the true extent of her service to their country. But sometimes, the universe has a way of correcting old injustices, of bringing hidden truths into the light when they are most needed. Sometimes, the heroes who have served in silence finally get their moment of recognition, their chance to be seen for who they really are and what they have accomplished. Margaret's moment was coming, though she didn't know it yet. Soon, very soon, someone would appear who knew exactly who she was and what she had done. Someone who would finally give her the recognition that had been decades in the making. The following Tuesday, Margaret arrived at her usual coffee shop to find an unexpected commotion. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance, and she could see several military personnel in dress uniforms speaking with what appeared to be local media representatives. Her first instinct was to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of her. As she approached cautiously, she overheard fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. They were talking about declassified military records, about operations from the 1000, 970 seconds, and 1,980 seconds that had recently been released to researchers. They were discussing a particular unit that had operated in Southeast Asia, conducting missions that had never been officially acknowledged. Margaret's heart began to race as she recognized the operation names being mentioned. These were missions she had not just participated in, but had often led. Operations that had been so classified that even mentioning their existence had been grounds for court-martial. And now, apparently, some details were being made public. She lingered at the edge of the crowd, trying to catch more of the conversation without drawing attention to herself. A young reporter was interviewing a military historian who had apparently been granted access to some of the newly declassified files. "What makes this particular unit so significant?" the reporter was asking. The historian, a middle-aged man with thick glasses and an academic bearing, consulted his notes before responding. This unit was responsible for some of the most successful covert operations in American military history. They prevented several potential international incidents that could have escalated into full-scale conflicts. But what makes them truly unique is that they included female operatives in combat roles, decades before women were officially allowed in such positions. Margaret felt her knees go weak. They were talking about her unit, her missions, her colleagues, people who had sworn oaths of secrecy that they had kept for over 40 years. How much did these researchers actually know? How much had been declassified? Unfortunately, the historian continued, many of the personnel records are still classified. We know these operations happened, and we know they were successful, but we don't know who the people were who carried them out. It's like trying to study history without being able to identify the historical figures involved. A sense of relief washed over Margaret. The operations were becoming public knowledge, but the identities of the operatives remained protected. She could live with her accomplishments being acknowledged in general terms, as long as her personal involvement remained secret. But then the historian said something that changed everything. There is one exception, though. We've been able to identify one member of this unit through cross-referencing various documents. A woman who appears to have been central to many of the most successful operations. We're still trying to locate her. Actually, the records suggest she's still alive and living somewhere in this general area. Margaret's world tilted on its axis. They were looking for her. After all these years of anonymity, someone was actively trying to find her and connect her to her classified service. The careful balance she had maintained between her secret past and her quiet present was about to be destroyed. She turned and walked quickly away from the crowd, her mind racing. How much time did she have before they found her? Her service records, even the classified ones, would contain enough personal information to track her down eventually. Her full name, her social security number, her last known address. If they were determined enough, if they had the right resources, they could find her. Back in her small apartment, Margaret sat at her kitchen table and tried to think through her options. She could leave. Of course, pack up her few belongings and move somewhere else, start over with a new identity. She had done it before, during her active service years, had become expert at disappearing when the mission required it. But she was 72 years old now, and the thought of starting over in a new city, of building a new life from scratch, felt overwhelming. This small town had become her home, the coffee shop, the familiar faces, the quiet routines that had replaced the chaos and danger of her former life. She wasn't ready to give all of that up. There was another option, one that terrified her even more than running. She could come forward voluntarily. She could contact the historians and researchers and tell them who she was and what she had done. She could finally claim the recognition that had been denied to her for so long. But the thought of public attention, of having her story become part of the historical record, of losing the anonymity that had protected her for decades, was almost paralyzing. She had spent so many years learning to be invisible that the idea of stepping into the light felt like a betrayal of everything she had become. Over the next few days, Margaret found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for a knock on her door or a phone call that would change her life forever. She avoided the coffee shop, afraid that the researchers might be there, asking questions, showing her photograph to the staff, trying to track her down through the small routines that had given her life structure and meaning. The isolation was becoming unbearable. She had always been alone with her secrets, but now, even her small daily connections to the world felt dangerous. She was trapped in her apartment, afraid to go out, afraid to stay in, afraid of the attention that seemed to be closing in around her. It was during this period of self-imposed isolation that Margaret began to truly reckon with the life she had lived and the choices she had made. She had given everything to her country, had sacrificed a normal life, a family, a career that could be acknowledged publicly. And for what? So that she could spend her final years hiding from the very recognition that should have been hers all along? She thought about the young soldiers she had encountered in the coffee shop. Their casual assumption that she was just another civilian observer. How different would their reaction have been if they had known that she had led missions more dangerous than anything they were likely to face? How different would the entire conversation have been if her true experience had been acknowledged? But more than that, she thought about all the other women who might benefit from knowing her story. Young female soldiers who were still fighting for recognition, still proving themselves in a military culture that had not always welcomed their contributions. Her story could inspire them, could show them that women had been serving with distinction in combat roles long before it was officially recognized. On the fourth day of her self-imposed isolation, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She picked up her phone and called the main number for the military historian she had seen on the news. When the receptionist answered, Margaret took a deep breath and said the words she never thought she would speak. "My name is Margaret Elizabeth Thompson," she said, using her full military name for the first time in decades. "I believe you've been looking for me." The silence on the other end of the line seemed to stretch forever. Then, in a voice filled with excitement and disbelief, the receptionist asked her to hold while she transferred the call to Dr. Harrison, the historian who had been leading the research. "Miss Thompson?" Dr. Harrison's voice was trembling with excitement. "Is this really you? Are you the Margaret Thompson who served with the 47th Special Operations Unit?" "I am," Margaret replied, feeling both relief and terror at finally speaking the words aloud. "Though I should warn you, there are things about my service that I still cannot discuss. Even now." "Of course. Of course," Dr. Harrison assured her. "We completely understand the constraints you're under. But Miss Thompson, do you realize what this means? You're a living legend. The operations you participated in, the leadership you provided, the lives you saved, it's all documented in the classified files. You're one of the most decorated soldiers in American history, and no one knows about it." Decorated. Margaret almost laughed at the word. Somewhere in a secure facility, there were indeed medals with her name on them. A silver star, 2 bronze stars, a Purple Heart, commendations that recognized courage and service that had never been publicly acknowledged, awards that she had never seen, never held, never been able to share with anyone. "Dr. Harrison," she said carefully, "I need you to understand something. I've lived a quiet life for many years now. I value my privacy. If I'm going to work with you on this research, if I'm going to share my story, I need to know that you'll respect certain boundaries." "Absolutely," he assured her. "We're not looking to sensationalize anything. We're historians, interested in preserving the truth of what happened. Your privacy and your comfort are our primary concerns." They arranged to meet the following day at a neutral location, a small restaurant outside of town where Margaret felt she could speak freely without being overheard. As she hung up the phone, she felt a mixture of emotions she hadn't experienced in years: fear, excitement, relief, and something else she couldn't quite identify at first. It was hope. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to hope that her service might finally be acknowledged, that her story might finally be told, that the sacrifices she had made might finally be recognized for what they were. The next morning, Margaret dressed carefully for her meeting with Dr. Harrison. She chose her best blouse, the one she usually reserved for church services, and a jacket that she thought made her look dignified rather than frail. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she tried to see herself as Dr. Harrison would see her. Not just an elderly woman with a secret past, but a living piece of history. Someone whose experiences had shaped the world in ways that few people would ever understand. Dr. Harrison was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 40s, with an intensity that reminded her of some of the younger officers she had worked with during her active service years. He had brought with him a thick folder of documents, photographs, and maps that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. "These are copies of some of the declassified materials," he explained as he spread them across the restaurant table. "Obviously, many details are still redacted, but you can see the scope of what we're working with." Margaret looked down at documents she hadn't seen in 40 years, mission reports with her code name at the top, operational maps that she had helped to create, photographs of locations where she had once operated under conditions of extreme danger. It was surreal to see these pieces of her past spread out in a public restaurant, no longer buried in classified files but part of an historical record that researchers could access and study. "The thing that strikes me most about these documents," Dr. Harrison continued, "is how consistently your name appears, not just as a participant in these operations, but as a leader. You were making decisions that affected international relations, commanding units that included personnel who outranked you officially. How did that work?" Margaret smiled at the question. "Officially, it didn't work at all. Unofficially, competence has a way of trumping protocol when lives are at stake. The men I worked with learned to trust my judgment because my judgment kept them alive." "But it must have been incredibly difficult, Doctor," Harrison pressed. "A woman in that environment, in that era, taking on leadership roles that weren't officially recognized. How did you manage the political aspects of that situation?" It was a complex question that touched on some of the most challenging aspects of Margaret's service. She had indeed faced resistance, skepticism, and outright hostility from some quarters, but she had also found allies in unexpected places. Commanders who recognized her abilities and were willing to bend the rules to utilize them effectively. "I learned early on that results speak louder than prejudice," she said carefully. "When missions succeed, when objectives are achieved, when people come home alive, questions about gender tend to become less important." They talked for 3 hours, with Dr. Harrison asking careful questions and Margaret providing answers that revealed as much as she felt comfortable sharing. It was exhilarating and exhausting at the same time, like opening a door that had been locked for decades and finally letting light into a room that had been dark for too long. As their meeting was winding down, Dr. Harrison mentioned something that caught Margaret's attention. "There's going to be a ceremony next month," he said. "The military is finally acknowledging some of the operations your unit was involved in. It won't be a full disclosure, of course, but it will be the first time these missions are publicly recognized. Would you consider attending?" Next on. Next on. Next on. Next on. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. A public ceremony, with military officials, with media attention, with the possibility that her decades of anonymity might finally come to an end. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've spent so many years staying out of the spotlight. I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of attention. I'm not sure I'm ready," she said honestly. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of attention." "You don't have to decide right now," Dr. Harrison assured her. "But I want you to know that your presence would mean a great deal to the people who understand what you've accomplished. There are senior military officials who have been briefed on your service, people who have wanted to thank you personally for years. Senior military officials." Margaret wondered who they might be talking about. She had worked with many young officers during her service years, men who were now probably senior commanders themselves. Did any of them remember her? Did any of them understand the full extent of what she had contributed to their early careers and to the missions that had shaped their understanding of military service. As she drove home from the restaurant, Margaret found herself thinking about the ceremony Dr. Harrison had mentioned. After decades of invisible service, she would finally have the opportunity to be publicly recognized for her contributions. It was an opportunity she had never thought would come, never dared to hope for. But it was also an opportunity that came with risks. Public attention would mean the end of her quiet, anonymous life. Media interest might bring unwanted scrutiny to her personal affairs, and there was always the possibility that not everyone would welcome the revelation that a woman had been serving in combat roles decades before it was officially sanctioned. Over the next few weeks, as Dr. Harrison continued his research and prepared his findings for publication, Margaret found herself wrestling with the decision about the ceremony. Part of her wanted desperately to attend, to finally step forward and claim the recognition that was rightfully hers. But another part of her was terrified of the changes that such recognition would bring to her carefully ordered life. The decision was made for her when she received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end of the line was formal, professional, and spoke with the kind of authority that Margaret recognized from her military years. "Miss Thompson, this is Colonel Sarah Martinez from the Pentagon. I'm calling on behalf of General William Richards, who would very much like to meet with you before the upcoming ceremony. The General has specifically requested the opportunity to speak with you about your service." General William Richards. Margaret knew that name, though she couldn't immediately place where she had heard it. A four-star general wanting to meet with her personally was not something she had expected, and it added a new dimension to the decision she was facing about the ceremony. "Colonel Martinez," Margaret said carefully, "I'm not sure I understand why a four-star general would want to meet with me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. And then Colonel Martinez spoke in a voice that carried a mixture of respect and something else that Margaret couldn't quite identify. "Miss Thompson, General Richards served as a young lieutenant under your command during Operation Silent Thunder in 1983. He credits you with saving his life and the lives of his entire unit. He's been hoping for the opportunity to thank you personally for over 40 years. Margaret stared at the phone long after Colonel Martinez had hung up, her mind reeling from what she had just learned. Lieutenant William Richards. The name came flooding back to her now, along with memories that she had kept buried for over 4 decades. Operation Silent Thunder. 1983. A mission that had gone catastrophically wrong from the very beginning. Intelligence failures, equipment malfunctions, and enemy forces that were far better prepared than anyone had anticipated. She remembered the young lieutenant, barely 25 years old, leading a unit that had been separated from the main force and pinned down by enemy fire in hostile territory. She remembered the impossible decision she had faced that night. The official mission parameters called for retreat, for abandoning the position, and minimizing casualties. But Lieutenant Richards and his men were trapped, with no way out and no hope of survival without immediate intervention. Going after them would mean violating direct orders, risking court-martial, and potentially compromising the entire operation. Margaret had made her choice in less than 30 seconds. She had assembled a rescue team, commandeered equipment that wasn't officially allocated to her unit, and launched an unauthorized mission that military protocol would have considered reckless at best and insubordinate at worst. But she couldn't leave those young soldiers to die. Not when she had the skills and resources to save them. The rescue had taken 18 hours of careful movement through enemy territory, using tactics and strategies that weren't in any official military manual. She had relied on years of experience, on instincts honed by dozens of similar situations, on a level of tactical knowledge that few people possessed. By the time she and her team reached Lieutenant Richards and his men, the situation had deteriorated to the point where they had less than an hour before their position would be completely overrun. Getting them out had required split-second timing, perfect coordination, and a degree of courage that still took her breath away when she remembered it. She had personally provided cover fire, while the trapped soldiers were evacuated, had been the last person to leave the rescue zone. and had sustained injuries that had left her hospitalized for 3 weeks. The mission had been classified at the highest levels, with all participants sworn to secrecy. Lieutenant Richards and his men had been debriefed and reassigned, with their rescue officially attributed to a routine patrol that happened to be in the area. Margaret's unauthorized mission had been buried so deep in classified files that even she had sometimes wondered if it had really happened. And now, 40 years later, that young lieutenant had become a 4-star general, and he wanted to meet with her. He wanted to thank her for something that officially had never occurred, for a rescue that had never been acknowledged, for a decision that had saved his life and the lives of his entire unit. The meeting was arranged for the following week at a secure conference room in a military facility outside the city. Margaret arrived early, unsure of what to expect or how to prepare for an encounter that would bring her face to face with someone whose life she had saved decades ago. General Richards was not what she had expected. The young, frightened lieutenant, she remembered, had been replaced by a distinguished man in his mid-60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in positions of significant responsibility. But when he looked at her, she could still see traces of the young soldier she had rescued all those years ago. "Miss Thompson," he said, rising from his chair as she entered the room. "Or should I say, Colonel Thompson? I know your final rank was classified, but I've been briefed on your complete service record, Colonel." Margaret hadn't heard herself addressed by her military rank in over 30 years. The promotion had been part of her classified service, awarded for achievements that could never be publicly acknowledged. To most people, she was simply Miss Thompson, a retired civilian with an unremarkable past. But to General Richards, she was a fellow officer, a superior, who had once held his life in her hands. "Margaret is fine, General," she said, though she was touched by his recognition of her military rank. "It's good to see you again, though, I have to admit, you've changed quite a bit since 1983. "I'm intended," General Richards laughed, a sound that carried both warmth and deep emotion. "I imagine we both have. But Miss Thompson, Margaret, I need you to understand something. Not a day has gone by in the last 40 years that I haven't thought about what you did for me and my men. You saved our lives, and you did it by risking everything you had worked for." He pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table between them. "This is my complete military record," he said. "Every promotion, every assignment, every achievement of the last 4 decades, none of it would have been possible without you. I wouldn't be here without you. My family wouldn't exist without you. The hundreds of soldiers I've had the privilege to lead over the years, they all owe their leadership to someone who should have died in a jungle in Southeast Asia if not for your courage." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had never thought about the ripple effects of that single decision. The lives that had been touched by the young lieutenant she had rescued. She had saved one man, but in doing so, she had inadvertently shaped the careers and lives of countless others who had served under his command over the decades. "Margaret," General Richards continued, his voice growing more serious, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know that you have every right to refuse. The ceremony that Dr. Harrison mentioned, the one where some of your unit's operations will finally be acknowledged? I've been asked to speak at that ceremony. I've been asked to represent the military's gratitude to the members of your unit." He paused, studying her face carefully. "But I don't want to speak in generalities about unnamed heroes. I want to tell your story. I want to publicly acknowledge what you did, not just for me and my men, but for your entire career of service. With your permission, I want to make sure that your contributions are finally recognized." The weight of what he was asking hit Margaret like a physical blow. Public acknowledgement, after decades of anonymity. Her story told by a 4-star general at a formal military ceremony. The end of her invisible existence, but also the beginning of the recognition she had never dared to dream of. "General," she said carefully, "I need you to understand that I've lived a quiet life for many years. I'm not sure I'm prepared for the kind of attention that would bring. I understand completely," he assured her. "But Margaret, There are people who need to hear your story. Young women serving in the military today, who face challenges you pioneered solutions for. Military historians trying to understand how women contributed to national security long before it was officially recognized. And frankly, old soldiers like me, who have carried the weight of gratitude for decades and never had the opportunity to express it publicly. They talked for 2 hours about the ceremony, about what would be said and how her story would be presented. General Richards made it clear that the decision was entirely hers, that he would respect whatever choice she made. But he also made it clear how much it would mean to him personally to finally be able to publicly thank the woman who had given him the opportunity to live the life he had lived. The ceremony was held on a crisp autumn morning at the Fort Braxton Parade Ground. Margaret sat in the front row, wearing the best dress she owned, feeling simultaneously invisible and exposed. The audience was filled with active duty military personnel, veterans, family members, and dignitaries. She recognized some faces from her past, people she had served with who were now senior officers themselves. When General Richards took the podium, the entire assembly fell silent. His presence commanded respect, and Margaret could see why he had risen to such a high rank. He spoke first about the unit as a whole, about operations that had remained classified for decades, about sacrifices that had never been publicly acknowledged. Then he began to tell her story. "There is one member of this unit," he said, his voice carrying across the parade ground, "whose contributions exemplify everything we honor here today. Her name is Margaret Elizabeth Thompson, and she served with distinction in roles that were not officially open to women at the time." Margaret felt every eye in the assembly turn toward her, but she kept her gaze fixed on General Richards, drawing strength from his steady presence at the podium. "Colonel Thompson," he continued, using her classified rank publicly for the first time, "led missions that saved countless lives and prevented international incidents that could have changed the course of history. But for me, her service is personal. In 1983, she risked her career and her life to rescue me and my unit when we were trapped behind enemy lines." The general's voice grew quieter, more personal. "She made an unauthorized decision to come after us, violating direct orders and putting herself in extreme danger. Because of her courage, because of her tactical brilliance, because of her refusal to abandon soldiers under her command, I lived to serve my country for 40 more years. My children exist because of her decision. My grandchildren exist because of her courage." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was thick with emotion. "Colonel Thompson has lived in anonymity for decades, her service hidden by classification requirements, her contributions unknown to the public she served so faithfully. Today, we finally have the opportunity to correct that injustice." General Richards stepped away from the podium and walked directly to where Margaret was sitting. The entire assembly rose to their feet as he approached her, and Margaret found herself standing as well, though her legs felt unsteady beneath her. "Colonel Margaret Elizabeth Thompson," General Richards said in a voice that carried across the silent parade ground, "on behalf of the United States military, on behalf of every soldier whose life you touched, on behalf of the grateful nation you served in secret for so many years, thank you." And then, in front of hundreds of people, this 4-star general, this man who commanded respect from military leaders around the world, rendered her the most perfect military salute Margaret had ever received. It was crisp, precise, and held with the kind of reverence usually reserved for the highest ceremonies of state. Margaret felt 40 years of invisible service crystallize into this single moment. Without thinking, her own hand rose in response, returning the salute with the precision and dignity of the career soldier she had always been. For those few seconds, she was not an elderly civilian sitting in a crowd, but Colonel Thompson, receiving the recognition that had been decades in the making. The applause that followed was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. It started with the military personnel in the assembly, but quickly spread to every person present. It was not polite ceremony applause, but genuine appreciation from people who understood the significance of what they were witnessing. As General Richards helped her to the podium, Margaret looked out at the sea of faces before her. She saw active duty soldiers, some of them women who would never have to serve in the shadows as she had. She saw veterans who understood the sacrifices required by military service. She saw family members who were learning for the first time about sacrifices that had shaped their world before they were born. 40 years ago, Margaret said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground, I took an oath to serve my country. That oath didn't come with conditions about recognition or acknowledgement. I served because it was the right thing to do. Because my country needed people willing to take on difficult missions in dangerous places. End. Oath wa. Well, she paused, looking directly at General Richards, who was standing at attention beside the podium. But I want you to know that this recognition, this moment, this opportunity to finally step out of the shadows, means more to me than any medal or commendation ever could. For 4 decades, I carried the weight of classified service alone. Today, I share that weight with all of you, and it feels lighter than it has in years. The ceremony continued for another hour, with other speakers and presentations, but Margaret barely heard them. She was lost in the surreal experience of being publicly acknowledged for achievements that had defined her life but had never been spoken of aloud. She was processing decades of invisible heroism suddenly made visible, years of secret pride finally validated by public recognition. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Margaret found herself surrounded by people who wanted to meet her, to thank her, to hear more of her story. Young female soldiers approached her with admiration and questions about how she had navigated the challenges of serving in an era when women's military contributions were not welcomed or acknowledged. Veteran men approached her with respect and curiosity, wanting to understand how someone had managed to lead successful missions while operating outside the official command structure. Military historians peppered her with questions about tactics and strategies that had never been documented in official records. But the encounter that moved her most was with General Richards' family. His wife, his children, his grandchildren, all came to meet the woman whose decision 4 decades ago had made their family possible. His youngest granddaughter, a girl of about 12, looked up at Margaret with wide eyes and said, "My grandfather says, you're the bravest person he's ever met." Margaret knelt down to the child's level and smiled. "Your grandfather is the brave one," she said. "I just made sure he had the chance to show the world how brave he could be." As the afternoon wore on and the crowd gradually thinned out, Margaret found herself alone with General Richards for a few quiet moments. They stood together at the edge of the parade ground, looking out at the base where so many soldiers were trained and prepared for service. "Do you have any regrets?" General Richards asked quietly. "About the secrecy, about the years of anonymity, about the way your service was hidden for so long?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I regret that other women had to fight battles I had already won, because my victories couldn't be acknowledged. I regret that lessons learned from my missions couldn't be shared to help future operations. I regret that young soldiers like the ones I met in the coffee shop assumed I didn't understand their experiences." She paused, watching a group of young soldiers practicing drill formations in the distance. "But I don't regret the service itself. I don't regret the missions, or the risks, or the sacrifices, and I don't regret the decision to rescue you and your men, even though it was unauthorized and dangerous. Some decisions are bigger than protocol, bigger than career considerations, bigger than personal safety." General Richards nodded. "That's what made you such an exceptional leader. You understood that the mission was always bigger than the rules, that people were always more important than procedure." As they prepared to part ways, General Richards handed Margaret a small wooden box. "This is for you," he said. "It's not much, but it's something I've wanted to give you for 40 years. Inside the box was a simple silver pendant, engraved with the dates of Operation Silent Thunder and the names of the soldiers who had been rescued. Below the names, in small script, were the words, "Leadership is not about the recognition you receive, but about the lives you touch." Margaret looked up at General Richards with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything. For remembering. For speaking up. For making sure my story was finally told. "Thank you," he replied, "for giving me the opportunity to have a story worth telling." As Margaret drove home that evening, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few hours. This morning, she had been an anonymous elderly woman with a secret past. Tonight, she was a publicly acknowledged military hero with a story that would be preserved for future generations. The coffee shop would be different now. The young soldiers she encountered there would know who she was, would see her not as a well-meaning civilian, but as a fellow veteran whose experience surpassed their own. The isolation of carrying classified secrets alone was over, replaced by the responsibility of being a public example of military service. It would take time to adjust to her new visibility, to learn how to live with recognition after decades of anonymity. But as she pulled into her driveway and looked at her small, quiet home, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of completeness. Her service had finally been acknowledged. Her story had finally been told. Her sacrifices had finally been recognized by the people who mattered most. The soldiers whose lives she had touched, the commanders who had trusted her judgment, the country she had served faithfully for so many years. The young lieutenant she had rescued in 1983 had become a distinguished general, and he had used his position and influence to ensure that her contributions would never again be invisible. It was, Margaret thought as she unlocked her front door, the most perfect ending to a story that had been decades in the making. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities that came with public recognition of her service. There would be interviews, speaking engagements, opportunities to mentor young soldiers and share the lessons learned from her unique career. Her quiet, anonymous life was over. But it was being replaced by something she had never expected: the chance to use her experience to inspire and guide others. As she sat in her living room that night, still wearing the dress she had chosen for the ceremony, Margaret thought about the young woman she had been when she first accepted those dangerous assignments. That woman could never have imagined that her secret service would someday be publicly celebrated, that her unauthorized rescue mission would be acknowledged by a 4-star general in front of hundreds of people. The journey from invisible hero to recognized veteran had taken 40 years, but it had finally reached its destination. Margaret Elizabeth Thompson, Colonel, United States Army, was no longer a secret. Her story was now part of the historical record, her contributions acknowledged, her sacrifices honored by the people who understood their true significance. The 4-star general had delivered his respectful salute, and with it, he had given her something more valuable than any medal: the knowledge that her service mattered, that her decisions had made a difference, that her willingness to risk everything for the soldiers under her command had created a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. It was, she realized, everything she had never dared to hope for. The invisible hero had finally stepped into the light, and the recognition was even more meaningful than she had imagined it could be.